What a great morning. If you have a Bible, I want to invite you to open it up to James chapter 5. We have 2 more weeks here in our walk through the letter of James this fall, and in 2 weeks, we'll be in the Advent season. We're going to be going through different passages in Isaiah, and so I'm really looking forward to that time of the Christmas season, of waiting and remembering Christ's first coming and anticipate his second coming. But today, we're in James chapter 5. And I really missed being with you guys last Sunday as I was visiting and helping serve at a church plant that we support in town, which was great, but my heart was just here, wanting to be here with you all. But I was so thankful for Jeff Mooney coming and sharing God's word with us. He's a great man. He's influenced my life and so many others in the kingdom in such a positive way. So I love him and so grateful that he came and gave us a timely word. But if you notice last week, the beginning of his passage he read at the end of chapter 4 is, "Come now, you who say." And then ours today begins with, "Come now, you rich." So these passages really go together. They're intended for us to understand them together. And last week, the passage that we looked at talked about the brevity of life, how life is just so short, right? And today, it transitions to helping us process through how even though life is so short, our moments can feel so long. Our moments can feel so long. That's the weirdest part about life, that it is so short, and yet it can feel so long. You know, we often just think, man, if I can just get through this, this season will never end. Man, if I can just get on the other side of such and such a date or such and such of an experience that I'm going through, then everything will be good again, And so we often process life and it feels slow if it's a season of suffering of some kind or unwanted circumstances. But then moments hit us and we go, man, life is just flying by, right? I mean, I grew up in the 90s and my kid calls it the 1900s, But to me, if you have like a 97 4Runner or something, I'm like, that's not that old. And I'm like, wait, it's getting older. That kind of experience, I have it all the time. I'll never forget being a kid. And adults would come up to me and go, man, I remember when you were this big. And as a kid, my eyes would kind of roll and I would internalize and go, I am never going to do that as an adult. And I do it all the time, you guys. And every time I do it, I try to stop myself and I think, what have I become? Like I'm doing the same thing. I'm just like, man, I remember when you were this big. But what's happening? Every adult almost can't even stop themselves from saying things like that. Why? Because in the moment, you're processing how much life is flying by. So it can go like that, but it can also feel so long. I think what might help us as an image is to kind of imagine that we were to take a Sharpie or something, and I was to go over to that wall and we were to draw a humongous line all the way around this room, okay? I won't do that, I'll get in big trouble, okay? But let's just imagine I did that, and we would say, this line, I want you to look at it, and it represents eternity, okay? Just imagine this line around the room. Okay, if you're really literal, you're like, well, that line would go on forever and ever, and I get that, okay? But let's just imagine that line represents eternity. And if I were to walk over to that line with just a little sticker or something, and I were just to tap it onto the line, it would be giving us perspective on how that little dot represents our lives in the midst of eternity. Our lives in the grand scheme of time are just a dot. They're nothing, but it can feel so long. That dot can feel like it's taking forever. But the question I think we need to consider this morning is, would you say that you live your life for the dot, or are you living for the line? Are you living for the dot, or are you living for the line? If you hold that image in your mind, are you living for the dot, or are you living for the line? James tells us in the first 6 verses, don't live for the dot. Don't live for the dot. What does he say? Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You've lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. The rich are told to weep and howl because the miseries are coming upon them. What's this talking about? Well, it's really clear. The things that they lived for are crumbling. The thing that looked so precious, the thing that looked so valuable, that thing that looked so pretty and I can't live without it kind of stuff, all of a sudden, the realness of what its value is rising to the surface. It's corroding. It's getting eaten up by little moths. But what the image is actually referring to, because wealth in and of itself is not bad, okay? Money in and of itself is not bad. But what are they doing with it? They're hoarding it. I mean, think about these images. The clothes get eaten by moths. Why do your clothes get eaten by moths? If you just throw it in the closet and you never touch it, right? Money doesn't really corrode, okay? But the image is it's doing that because it's not even being used. You don't really need all this stuff, but you're just trying to get more and more of it. You're hoarding it, right? And it's decaying in the end. Even the flesh, the beauty of the flesh is burning, it's decaying. What looks so attractive is no longer seen as that. These people are living comfortably in their life. It's a picture of massive waste, is what James is saying. Right, but there's more. We have 3 you-haves here. Look in verse 4. What have they done? They have been unjust. Right, there's people that they've hired that work for them, that depend on that wage just to get by that day. And yet they've looked at their lives and they haven't even given them what they're due. They've done the work rightly and they've still just, maybe they've fallen through the cracks. Maybe they're that selfish and that hoarding in their heart that they don't even want to give away the dollars that are due to somebody else that did stuff for them. But these people are not even making ends meet because of this. And they're crying out from the fields. And what does it say? The Lord of hosts hears them. That's military language. He's the God of armies, untold numbers. It's just, you're to imagine a God with just an uncountable amount of soldiers that is going to come to their defense, that is going to rise up and come to their aid and give justice when it's time. God hears them even if their wealthy owner or boss doesn't. What else have they done? They've lived a life of self-indulgence. Do you see that in verse 5? They're so self-indulged that they're fattened up, right? If you're fattened up, it means you live a really comfortable life, you know? I mean, it's Thanksgiving week. I'm sure many people who raise turkeys for Thanksgiving, they want them to have a nice life, fatten them up, get them going, right? Just prepare them for what? The day of slaughter. Okay, and you're going to enjoy it this Thursday. And now some of you aren't going to eat turkey because I just said that, okay? But that's the image. You're so comfortable. You have so much, more than enough, and it's just going to be to your ruin, ultimately. What is the last thing they've done? They have condemned and murdered the righteous person, the person who's in the right. And there is no reason to think that this wasn't literally true. That there could be people who are poor that are protesting because they're not giving the wages they're actually due, and in turn, the person isn't just making things that are wrong righted, they're just doing away with them, they're silencing them, they're even killing them, because who are they? I don't need them. I'll just hire another person. So in summary, who are these people? They're people that are living for the dot, right? They've mistreated, they've even killed and silenced some, they've had more than enough, they've hoarded, they've lived like this is all there is. And you can do that. You can totally do that. But your laughter will be turned into weeping and howling, James says. Your delights will become your misery because what you thought was so valuable and precious will one day prove to be your downfall. Who is James talking to here? That's a really important question. Because earlier in James, we've seen the tensions of the rich and the poor in this church that James has been writing to. We've seen it in chapter 1, that the lowly brother is to boast in his exaltation, his seated position in the gospel with Christ. We've seen the rich who's to boast, the rich brother who's to boast in his humiliation and his position with Christ in the cross. We've looked at chapter 2, how people are gathering for worship and a person with nice clothes and a person with shabby clothes comes in, and people who have nice clothes are being treated better than others, right? So we've seen these tensions throughout the letter so far, and so we might get to here and think James is writing to rich Christians. But what's very interesting is in verses 1 through 6, he doesn't refer to them as that, right? He's been so liberal with using that word brothers, hasn't he? Brothers and sisters. He's just throwing it out left and right, almost like as a filler word. And even when you get to verse 7, he uses it again in verse 7, verse 9, verse 10, verse 12. He keeps talking to you, hey, brothers, Christian, that's family language. But here in verses 1 through 6, he doesn't use it. So what's he doing? James is giving you and I, if you're a Christian, the ability to eavesdrop on what he would be saying to someone who is not a Christian who is living for the dot and oppressing people along the way. He wants you to know what he thinks about people who live that way. Why? So that you wouldn't be tempted to go after that same thing too. It's so that you wouldn't think that you're losing and they're winning. It's so that you would realize you're winning and they eventually will seem to be losing. But I also think it has another edge to it, because even though the language here is condemnation language, it's judgment language, if you are a Christian, I think it's pretty easy for us, especially living in the West, to read something like this, and only if we are proud would we read something like this and go, doesn't apply to me. It just applies to non-Christians. No, I think we would read this, and there feels like there's an edge to it for us too. We could see ourselves here. So this really is also intended to be something that wakes us up and causes us to go back to Jesus. I mean, even the language itself, weep and howl. I mean, if you go back to chapter 4, verse 8, what does he say? Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. This is saying you should not be happy in your sin. This is saying that you should recognize it and draw near to God, right? To find forgiveness and freedom in the arms of your Lord Jesus. That's what this is intended to do to us here today. There is time today. Like if you read this passage and you see its application in your life, there is time today. If you go, I'm living for the dot, there is time to turn, to go back and go, Lord, forgive me. Help me to walk in your ways. I wish we all had a sensitive heart like John Wesley did. I know I read about John Wesley, lived in the 1700s, and I go, man, I wish I had that kind of a heart. Because he's famous for talking about wealth and money and things like that, if you don't know. And you could not like what he says, but it's at least interesting and challenging. He tells a story when he lived in Oxford, how he bought some pictures and stuff to hang up in his house. And then a little bit later, it was like the dead of winter, some girl came up and he saw that she had just a thin gown and she was freezing. So he reached into his pocket to grab some money to give it to her so she could buy a coat. But he didn't have enough. And he goes, man, if I would not have bought those wall hangings, I could have provided for it. And he felt so convicted by that. And so this is what he decided to do. From that day on in 1731, he determined to maintain his same standard of living, and anything else he made above that, to give it away. So his standard of living was 28 pounds, and so if he made 30 pounds, he gave it away, the 2 pounds. Once he started making 60 pounds, he gave away 32. When he made 120 pounds, he gave away 92. Right? At one point in his life, he made 1,400 British pounds, and he lived on 30 pounds and gave the rest away. And he famously said, the question is not how much of my money will I give to God, but how much of God's money will I keep for myself? That's what he said. Now, right now, there's many of us in this room, I'm betting, who hear that and you go, well, that's just those crazy Christian people who just are like weird, you know? And you're like, yeah, there are some extreme people, but at the same time, it at least causes me to go, whose voice am I listening to in my life when it comes to the things that I have? Am I just listening to the world and the world says, this is what you should do with your wealth, this is what you need, this is what you must have, and I'm going to play by those rules, I'm going to live for the dot? Or do you take even the principles of what John Wesley is saying and go, everything I have is God's, and so I want to live for the line. I want to live for the line. Guys, this is so hard, isn't it? I mean, we are all tempted to live for the dot. Even from a young age, we're tempted to live from the dot. I mean, we're growing up playing like Monopoly and Life. And yesterday I was with my sister and brother-in-law and our kids downtown at Jack's Toy Shop, and we're looking at the board games. And I found the board game I grew up playing with my sister at my grandma's house. It's called Payday. You guys ever play Payday? That was amazing, right? But it's just cultivating a life where it's fun, whatever, it's a game, right? You need money in this world. But it's almost like training you to be like, this is the life I want, you know? It was so appealing even as a kid. But then if that's how we live our life, if we just live for the dot, we will get to a place in our lives where we realize, man, that wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it. So instead of living for the dot, he says what? Be patient for the line. Live for the line. Verse 7, what does he say? Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it, until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. So he says, be patient, therefore, which is connecting basically everything he's ever said in this letter to this moment. He's essentially talking about all the different ways that you and I might suffer in this broken world. What has he talked about all so far? Our suffering, our disappointments, our frustrations and our conflicts with other people, our unanswered prayers, our unfulfilled dreams, the mistreatment of us from other people. He's saying in light of all these things, God is doing something good. He's doing something good, but in order to experience that goodness, you need to live with patience. You need to live with patience. Right? Be patient, therefore, brothers. Be patient like the farmer, he says. He gives you a picture of a farmer. For people in James's day, farming was woven into the fabric of everyday society. You know, this would be like, I don't know, it's probably a bad example, but like if you're like, it's like the cell phone maker and you're like, I got a cell phone, right? I understand that, right? Being a farmer was not a specialized thing. Nowadays, if you meet a farmer, you're like, whoa, there's still farmers? You know, like that's kind of how we often feel. But in his day, this was so common. It wasn't a specialty. And what is he waiting for, though? What's he waiting for? What does it say? The rains. The rains. He's done the work, he's cultivated the field, he's planted the seeds, and now he has to wait for the rains. He's not in control of the rains. As you saw this week, maybe the rains came when you didn't want them to come, but you just had to accept them, right? If you wanted it to rain, you don't get to control the weather, right? But it rains. You have to wait for it, though. And that's what he's doing. He's going to pull the weeds. He's going to do the necessary patient work that has to be done in that process, but he has to wait. If you grow impatient, if he goes over and goes, man, why is this not going faster? And he digs up the seed and he looks at it and he goes, I'm going to put it over here now, you know? And he just thinks that somehow putting it somewhere else is going to create a speed that is not happening in that seed. It's not going to work, right? We know this. If you did that, someone would say, hey, you should probably not do farming, you know? Like you don't want to keep pulling up the seed because it's not going fast enough. You have to wait. You got to cultivate. But something good's coming. I just learned this week that there is a plant that is only located in Southwest America. It's called the century plant. You guys have heard of this century plant? Okay. Some of you might have one at your house. I've seen some around. It's fascinating, though. It's called the century plant, but I don't know why, because it blooms every 30 to 40 years. Okay, so not every 100 years, but every 30 to 40 years. There she is, right? It's amazing, though. It's a plant that blooms every 20 or 30 years. It stands 6 foot tall, and it has this shoot that grows up, but it's like a shoot like an asparagus type shoot, okay? It can grow so high at a fantastic rate of 7 inches per day, and eventually reaches an eventual height of 20 or 40 feet. But the crowning of this plant is that it will blossom, yellowish blossoms that last up to 3 weeks every 20 or 30 years. You got to wait for it. Isn't that amazing? In the same way, the century plant, many of the most glorious things that happen to us come after a long wait. They come after a long wait, and you can't speed it up. Right? The blooming will come. The blooming of justice will come. Guys, but this is hard, isn't it? I mean, why is it hard to think like this? I mean, if I told you to be patient, no one immediately feels like, oh, good. Right? You're like, okay, I should. That's not a great word. We were repulsed by this idea, aren't we? I mean, if you're like me, you go get gas at Costco or something like that, and what do? You measure up all the lines. You're trying to find the shortest one, and then if you're really sick, you like judge where everyone's at so that when you're leaving, you're like, oh, I failed, or oh, I won, And you're like, I got through before they did, that kind of thing. I chose the right line. Or you're stuck in traffic and you're looking at all the cars around you. I'm going to try this lane, and that kind of thing. Is it just me, right? Right? We don't want to be patient. We live with one-click shopping, right? Nowadays, we stream shows. We don't have to wait a whole week anymore. I've often thought back, like, man, if I had to wait a whole week, I wonder how I would even process that. We live in an instant gratification culture where it's convenient for us to have things immediately. We love the idea, but it has negative effects on us. Do you see that negative effect in your life? Do you see what it's doing? If you don't live with that middle ground, what's happening to us is when we have to wait, that frustration catapults us into crisis every time. I don't have what I want right now. I am in crisis because I'm frustrated. You feel that? You feel that? There's no middle ground in our lives now between desire and fulfillment of that desire. It's getting shorter and shorter, and we think this is how life should be. We don't know what to do with that space, but that space is called patience. It's called patience. The word literally means long suffering. Long suffering. The other word used in our passage, verse 11, is what? Steadfastness. Steadfastness. What does he say? We consider those blessed who remain steadfast. It means to keep getting up, to keep getting back on your feet. Even if you get knocked down, you keep standing. You're like Rocky in the ring, right? Even though you're getting blistered by this world, you keep standing up. You keep getting back up. Right? You're like Chumbawamba. You get knocked down, you get up again, right? You just keep getting back up. You're patient. You're long-suffering, just like the farmer. Just like the farmer. How are you going to do this? How are you going to live for the dot? How are you going to live in the dot for the line? How are you going to do that? Well, that's where James leads us finally. Beginning of verse 9, what does he say? Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job. You have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath. But let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. He gives us 3 things here at the end for how we are supposed to live in this dot for the line. And they're directional, actually. The first one is to watch your present words. He keeps talking about your words. You're probably tired of it, aren't you? But you see the pattern. He says, be patient like the farmer. Do not grumble. Right? It's coming. Be patient like the prophets in Job. And then he says, but above all, do not swear. He's talking about your words. He's identifying the opposite of patience. How do you know that you're not being patient? What are you saying, James says? Are you grumbling? Like the Israelites that wandered in the desert before they were promised to enter the promised land, right? And they were like, this is not it. We're in the season of waiting, this long suffering. They grumbled. They grumbled against God. Their frustration is creating a crisis in their life. So you grumble against God, and the way that we know we're grumbling against God is when we start grumbling against each other. So he says, do not grumble, watch your words. Remember how James taught us that our words are just a revealing of our own hearts? He's saying if I'm grumbling with my mouth, it's showing you that my heart is not patient. My heart is not long-suffering. My heart is saying, let's dig up the seed, let's speed this up, right? Let's get out of this. But then look at verse 12. He says, do not swear. Don't make these double-minded vows. Don't say things that you don't know you can even do, which just would literally have been very practical. If you were a poor person in this church, you might say things like, I swear by God that I will pay this back to you. I'll do it. I'll make it up to you. You could make these rash statements with your words, but when you make a rash promise with your words, what does that do? It makes you now have to speed up to try to fulfill that. Our rash vows create rash action. And so James is saying, what are your words doing? Watch your words. Are they revealing a patient heart? But then secondly, what does he say? It's to look back, to remember God's past faithfulness. Remember his past faithfulness. We see this in verses 10 through 11. We are told to remember God's compassion and mercy by looking at the prophets, by considering how they lived, what they talked about, how what they said didn't come to fulfillment right then. It took time, and they suffered for it. Be patient in suffering by looking back. To look back and remember, God has been faithful. He's always been faithful. He will continue to be faithful. We look back and realize that what we're going through is not novel, you guys. It's actually very humbling and gives you perspective when you're going through something that feels so hard, and then you see someone else go through it, or you hear about someone else going through it, and you're like, oh, this is not just me. I think a dumb example of this is I went with my friend named Josh. All my friends are named Josh. And we went to visit some missionaries in Tibet. We're in the last tooth of the Himalayas, super high altitude. And he kept saying, hey, we got to hike over these hills today to go visit these villages. And what they call hills, I call peaks. I mean, they were massive. And I am not kidding, to this day, I can't even describe it. It was the hardest physical thing I've ever done in my life. I was dying, okay? We were just like, we thought we were in shape. I was much younger then. And we were dying. But towards the end of the day, we're like, we didn't see anybody out there the whole time. Towards the end of the day, we're like, man, we're like heroes. You know, we're beasts, right? Like, we're just like out here killing these peaks, you know, that kind of thing. And then towards the end, all of a sudden, I saw these kids just running up and down them and playing and laughing, right? And in that moment, I realized, man, if a kid can do it, that brings some normalcy, at least into my life, some humility into my life, right? Like, this is not that hard compared to what other people do all the time. Guys, when you're suffering in a long-suffering sort of way, when you're patiently enduring something, you're not blazing a new trail, you're walking a very well-worn path. And that's exactly what he's reminding you of. Remember Noah? He was told to build a boat. Everyone thought he was crazy for 120 years before it rained. Remember Joseph? He got a dream from God, and then his brothers sold him in slavery, went into prison. All these horrible things happened, but eventually God raised him up. Remember Isaiah, right? He wrote all these amazing things. He prophesied about the suffering servant Jesus and all that he would do. Yet all of his poems, all of his words, they weren't a best-selling book. You know, he wasn't a multi-platinum worship leader or something like that, right? No, he got cut in half by a king. Do you remember Jeremiah, who would sit in the mud up to his armpits? He wrote a book of Lamentations. Ezekiel had to lay on his side for over 300 days, suffering for God. Remember David, who was king, but yet had to hide in caves for 7 years, or Daniel, who suffered the entire time while he was in captivity, right? Or Paul, who was beaten and bled and died for the sake of Jesus. Are we tracking here? Are we looking back here? All these people went through deep darkness, but all of them, James says, you would look at them now and say, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. I don't think that fits within our paradigm. You wouldn't be sitting there next to Jeremiah going, this guy's blessed, right? Would you be doing that? And he goes, and let's also not forget Job. He gives him the most airtime. The man who lost everything, family, wealth, everything. Even his friends were terrible. But at the end, God restores his fortunes, not as some prosperity promise to give to you, but to show you that the arc of time that God is working with always is bending towards the good. No matter what we're going through, we know how this whole thing will end. We know that your fortunes will ultimately be restored when you see Jesus face to face. This is the promise. This is the promise. I can't tell you how many days, you guys, I've had to just whatever it is that I'm going through, I literally look just back at the cross and the resurrection of Jesus, the one who was truly the righteous one, who suffered and was murdered and died because of my sin. And I look back at the cross in the midst of what I'm going through and I go, I at least can look there and go, I know he loves me. It might not feel like it right now, but I know he loves me. I remember that he was crucified on Friday and risen on Sunday, and there was a Saturday where nothing happened and they waited patiently. They could do nothing about it, just wondering, God, where are you? We can look back and we can remember that. But then you and I can also look back and you can think about that moment that you walked through that was so difficult that you were just like, I wish I could get out of this right now. I wish we could speed up this process. And you look back on that moment today and now you've seen God's faithfulness. So how do you think about it now in light of that day? You go, yeah, I remember that was hard, but you don't feel it that way anymore, do you? You go, yeah, I'm in a weird way kind of glad I went through that. I can see God's goodness still in my life even today. We can look back on God's faithfulness through the prophets, through the gospel of Jesus Christ, but we can also see God's faithfulness in our lives. But that's not where he ends. The last thing we need to do is also to what? This is the big thrust of the whole passage. While you wait and live for the line, anticipate Jesus' future arrival. Anticipate his future arrival. You see in verse 8, he says, what does he say? Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. That means to become fixed like concrete. He's talked about this throughout the entire book, these unstable people who are just tossed about. They're like the wind, they're like the grass, they're getting hit up by the waves. But you're to establish your hearts. How? How do you establish your heart? You anticipate Jesus' coming. You remember that not only did he die for you and rise for you, and is he reigning today, sitting at the right hand of God, he's promised to come back, and that might feel like it's taking a while, but it's not. It's at hand. It's near. And every generation can hold that promise as truth for them. It's near, meaning there's nothing now as an obstacle in the way for him to come back. God has fixed a day in the calendar for when he will do that, and no one knows it but him. But we know that he will do it. We know that he's faithful. We know that he'll come through on his word. This is where everything hinges. If you live for the dot, this is bad news. If you live for the line, your heart is going to get really excited here. Because what's it saying? The judge is standing at the door. I mean, have you ever just had a day where you're like, man, I just want a day at home, nice cozy day with the family. I don't want to be interrupted. I'm going to turn my phone off. And then someone just knocks on your door unexpectedly. Have you ever had that happen to you? Maybe a lot of days, I don't know. What do? You say, nobody move, right? Just act like we're not here, right? Don't answer the door, okay? Am I the only one, right? Maybe done that once, I don't know, right? You're just like, I don't want to get it. I don't want to answer the door. Some of you are great and you get up and you're like, welcome, come on in, have some coffee. You know, that kind of person. And you're wonderful. I want to be like you. But so many days when you're not wanting someone to arrive and they're going to throw everything off, you're like, please go away. It's not exciting, right? It's an obstacle to your day, isn't it? But what if you're waiting for someone to come, that you've been wanting to come? Like whenever my wife goes out of town, when my kids were much younger especially, for like retreats and things like that, it's always fun to be with the kids, but I'm also like, oh, I can't wait for her to come back, you know? Because I'm like, man, she does so much, and that's very apparent, you know? But when she would come, I mean, it was exciting. You're like, oh, Elizabeth's home now. You know what I mean? Maybe you've been waiting for your child to come home. Maybe you've been waiting for a spouse to return. You haven't seen your parent in years. I don't know who it is, right? But you've probably anticipated and been longing for someone to knock on that door. And how do you respond? With excitement. This is saying that Jesus himself, he's standing at the door. His return is very near. I know in the, time with your view of time and God's view of time are a little bit different, and how we perceive that, but he's saying it's near. There's nothing in the way now. He's standing at the door. What's your heart doing? If you're in verses 1 through 6 and you're living for the dot, you're like, I don't want you to be here. I don't want this interrupted, right? This is not good news. That would be weeping and howling and that kind of thing. But if you are waiting patiently, you're living for the line, this is amazing news. That Jesus is coming back and that justice you've been longing for is going to bloom. It's going to bloom. It's going to be worth it. And you're going to say, oh, I'm so glad I waited. Guys, what are the things that you're investing in right now? And if Jesus were to return today, would investing in those things be worth it? Would investing in those things be worth it? I was just talking this week to some pastors, and a few of them were talking about burnout. I know people are talking about burnout a lot these days. But I thought somebody talked about it pretty well when they said burnout is like the feeling like you're running a race and you don't know where the finish line is. You might even say, hey, where's the finish line? Is it around the corner? And the person says, I don't know, man, just keep running. Just keep running. If you're just running and running and running and you don't know where the finish line is, how's that going to work in your life? You're going to give up, aren't you? See, a lot of us, though, when we were talking about living for the line, we're living for the turn around the bend. Like, if I could just get through Christmas, if I could just get through this busy season of kids' youth sports or whatever it is, If I could just have this change, that'll be the line. But then you get to the line and it's not enough. People are like, oh, you got to keep running. It's so important that we keep the real line in our view as we live this life. Living for the line changes everything. But that line is not just a destination. That line is a person who is standing at that door, is ready to welcome you into his life. Is he who you're living for? Are you living for the line? Let's go into our time of response. I would love for you just to bow your head. We could posture our hearts here in a moment of silence. Again, we live in a noisy, busy world. We all feel it. A world that wants to fill in the gap so we don't feel the frustration that then becomes a crisis. I want you to take this moment just to process this passage with God. Consider, what are the things that you're investing in? Is that going to be worth it when he returns? If Jesus were to show up today, what would your response be? Would you be like, oh man, I wasn't ready yet. I had a few more things I really wanted to do. Or would you run to that door? Lord Jesus, this morning, I pray that you would correct our hearts to live for the things that last, for the things that matter. That we would not only live in light of your past faithfulness, but in your promise that you're going to return and that you're going to bring the justice. There's going to be a flowering, Lord, a beauty that comes ahead. And I pray that we would set our gaze on that day. Help us to live in light of that day. God, help us to live for the line. I pray that we'd be a church that lives for the line. Where people would look at us and turn their heads a bit. And our only response would be that we have you, we have all that we need. You are our wealth, Lord Jesus. You're the one who suffered and bled and died for us. Would you posture our hearts to be anticipating your return? Lord, I pray for anybody here today that doesn't know you, that you would be working in their life and that they would cry out to you in faith. That the baptisms we witnessed today would one day become their baptism, that they would find new life in you. And maybe the things that they're living for, their true beauty would be revealed in their life right now, Lord, that they would long for treasure that doesn't fade. In Christ's name I pray.